Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. We tackle issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. Now, I did a program a couple of days ago on the SIPRI, the new SIPRI book, with particular reference to the nuclear weapons chapters in it. And they tell us that the salience of the world's nuclear arsenals is on the rise. The developing nuclear weapon states are funding modernization programs, and nuclear weapons are becoming more prominent in military strategies and also rhetoric. If we refer to what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has been saying within the backdrop of the Russo-Ukraine war and the West's support for Kyiv. So essentially, the post-Cold War period of reductions in nuclear stockpiles is basically over. We are now sliding back into nuclear competition and in some cases, arms race between dyads. But this is not all. There's a major war going on in Europe, and the Middle East is witnessing horizontal escalation because of Israel's savage war on Gaza. That escalation is now threatening to go vertical. 50 other internal conflicts mar the peace across the globe. Arms control is about trust. Trust is in very short supply these days, and in many cases is running deep deficits. For instance, let me just give you an example of a recent debate in South Korea. And this is, I'm quoting from one of the reports, essentially, words to that effect. 71 years to the day since North Korea invaded the South, one of South Korea's highest profile politicians has declared that Seoul should go nuclear. And she said it's the June 25 anniversary today. And this is Na Kyung-won, and she's a front runner to lead the Conservative People's Power Party. And this is something that she wrote on Facebook. Now we have to arm ourselves with nuclear weapons too. Now that has begun a debate in South Korea that's not dying down. Now, additionally, we see states working on emerging technologies that separately and in tandem with nuclear weapons give us an impending sense of unknown applications and their attendant threats, what scholars call the entanglement of nuclear and conventional forces, and put the development under the rubric, the third nuclear age. Now, today, I have one of the foremost scholars on this issue with me. Dr. Benjamin Zala is a fellow in the Department of International Relations at the Australian National University. His work focuses on the politics of the great powers and the management of nuclear weapons. In fact, last year in an article on India-Pakistan nuclear postures, I quoted him on the problem of non-nuclear strategic weapons with reference to the problems thrown up by the third nuclear age. Ben, thank you so much for being on the program. Now, I quoted this in the previous program also with reference to Salvador de Madriaga, was a Spanish diplomat and was also once chairman of the League of Nations Disarmament Commission. And his direction of causality in armament efforts, I think, was spot on. He said the trouble with disarmament was and still is that the problem of war is tackled upside down and at the wrong end. Essentially, that nations don't distrust each other because they're armed because they distrust each other. So let's begin with that. But before we get to that, I want you to explain to the viewers the idea of this nuclear and conventional forces entanglement, what you call the broader sort of rubric, as I said, the third nuclear age. And then we will proceed further from your explanation of what it means.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm already a fan of the series, so it's very nice to be with you.
Thank you.
This question of nuclear conventional entanglement refers to the entangling of nuclear weapons capabilities, nuclear forces, and conventional forces, but not just any conventional forces. These are often referred to by slightly different names, slightly different terminology. Sometimes people refer to them as advanced conventional weapons. Others, a couple of scholars and I have settled on this terminology of strategic non-nuclear weapons, by which we mean they're non-nuclear, they're conventional, they don't rely on a nuclear explosion, but they can have strategic impact in that they can be used in some way to compromise an adversary's nuclear forces. So they have an effect on the strategic balance, on the nuclear balance. And what scholars are concerned about is the ways in which these strategic non-nuclear capabilities become bound up in nuclear command and control systems in various ways, and how the co-location and the intermingling, the entanglement of these forces may actually create, if you like, pathways to nuclear escalation, from moving from a conventional conflict to a nuclear conflict. It's not a new phenomenon. So nuclear conventional entanglement's been around for a long time. Effectively, as long as nuclear forces have existed, to some degree, they've been somewhat entangled with conventional forces. But there's a trend currently, and this is what a lot of us are working on, and this is what's captured by a lot of this work that, as you say, is coming under this banner of a sort of a shift to a new nuclear age that we're referring to as a third nuclear age, in which these strategic non-nuclear forces are playing, I guess, a sort of elevated role, a particularly prominent role. We're concerned that these capabilities are being deployed much more widely, and that due to recent technological breakthroughs, technological developments, particularly in terms of remote sensing, the ability to find an adversary's nuclear forces, and in terms of things like missile accuracy, so the ability to actually hit them accurately and take them out, that these forces are now having a really large strategic effect. And we're starting to see those effects in different ways, and starting to sort of drive nuclear politics, if you like. And they're entangled in terms of the sense of some of these are dual use technologies. So, for example, it might be that your satellites are used for the targeting, to give you targeting information for both your nuclear and your conventional forces. So if you and I are in a conventional conflict and I want to inhibit your ability to target me with your conventional forces, I might take out one of those satellites with an anti-satellite weapon. But in so doing, I've also compromised your nuclear forces, because you now aren't able to target your nuclear forces against me as effectively. And so you have to think about this in terms of, well, am I now compromising your nuclear forces? Is this an attack on your nuclear weapons capability? And those lines between conventional and nuclear forces can become blurred very quickly and very easily. And this is what worries us when we think about escalation from conventional to nuclear conflicts.
So let me see if I've got this right. So let's assume we're talking about dual-use technology. So you got these hypersonic glide vehicles that can have a tactical warhead, but because of accuracy, because of very small CEPs on these missiles, if, hypothetically speaking, which I think is what you're saying, which is why I'm trying to assail it from another angle to see if I got it right, that you decide that you're going to use counterforce strategies through conventional warheads against nuclear forces, which then puts a completely different pressure on deterrence and deterrence calculations of the adversaries whose nuclear forces have been taken out, because X has not used nuclear weapons to take out the nuclear forces or part of the nuclear forces. So how does the affected state respond to that?
That's exactly right.
So I've got that right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we worry about these capabilities, these strategic non-nuclear weapons, so much for really two reasons. One that you've just alluded to, in the sense that because of these developments on the conventional side, I may not need to cross the nuclear threshold. I may not need to use nuclear weapons to attack your nuclear forces. And you're then thrown into this position of thinking, well, how do I respond? Because if you respond with any nuclear weapons that are left, you are the one sort of instigating the nuclear attack. You're the first one to cross that line. The second reason we worry about it is that if you think there is some sort of effect, some sort of impact of what we call the nuclear taboo, this sort of taboo against using nuclear weapons, even if you think, look, some of this stuff about the nuclear taboo is a little bit overplayed and so forth, but it's not a huge leap to say that I think any decision maker is going to at least think twice about being the first decision maker since 1945 to use the ultimate weapon. Well, if I didn't need to, I'm probably more likely to engage in that attack. This is not, at least to my mind, this is not really a problem that we should worry about in terms of bolt out of the blue attacks. I don't think anyone's going to wake up on Tuesday morning and decide, right, I'm just going to use all my forces now and engage in a counterforce strike against a nuclear armed adversary, because all states know that the stakes are very, very high in this. The risks are huge. Where I think it is a more likely issue is in a conventional war. So if you and I are in a conventional war, we're both losing personnel, we're losing our citizens. There is serious escalation potential here. We really worry about the other side going nuclear because it's ramping up and up. And then my military chief comes to me and says, look, we did draw up a plan for taking out the other side's nuclear forces if we really thought that we would have to, and you won't have to cross the nuclear threshold to do it. I would have to look at that plan pretty closely, because I'm saying I've got the ability to, ensure that my population isn't going to be on the receiving end of a nuclear attack, and I don't have to conduct a nuclear attack to do it. So it makes them much more usable in that regard.
So what would be this is very interesting, because this is what one of the senses that I had when I was reading literature by you and Andrew Footer, and that this is a major problem because it complicates the deterrence calculus. Now, how does, if the affected state, let me put it like this, it's a different kind of failing impotent and failing deadly problem, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So the attacking state has not attacked me with nuclear weapons, but it has attempted to degrade my nuclear capability, my nuclear forces, and B, it might, in this particular hypothetical scenario, it has actually succeeded in degrading some of my nuclear forces. Now, if I resort to a nuclear response, then I am the one that has actually broken the taboo, right? But at the same time, some decision maker could say that crossing the nuclear threshold, regardless of what kind of weapons have been used, is essentially about attack on nuclear forces. So, and thereby justifying the idea of, if necessary, a nuclear response. Now, let me further complicate this before I get your take on this. So let's assume state X has a political declaration of no first use. State Y has a declaration of first use. Right? So state X and Y get into a spat, which is obviously the biggest euphemism since Noah said it's about to rain. but so state X, on the basis of state Y's first use, and also declarations at some point by state Y that they have developed tactical nuclear weapons, could say, well, we didn't know those tactical nuclear weapons could be dispersed. They could be in the battlefield. There is first use, which could indicate, if not first, then an early use. So we have decided to preempt that. And that further complicates the situation, and it basically completely, as from where I stand, completely unravels deterrence.
Yeah, I think what it does is pushes states towards, not necessarily directly to, there might be all sorts of pathways where you can sort of get off, sort of off ramps, if you like, but it pushes you much closer towards this sort of worst case scenario, the nightmare scenario that we all talk about, under the terminology of a use it or lose it situation. But effectively, I think this is the early stages of an attack. I don't know how extensive this attack is going to be, but I'm already, if it's losing satellites or losing submarines, so anti-submarine warfare is a part of these strategic non-nuclear capabilities. I have, let's say it's cyber attacks on my command and control systems. I'm not confident that I'm able to communicate with commanders in the field who need to launch missiles, whatever it is. And so I've got to make that judgment. Are you beginning the early stages of a full counterforce strike? And do I get anything off the ground now that I've got left? Because otherwise you're coming anyway, and waiting for you is effectively suicide, right? If I think you're coming anyway, waiting around isn't a particularly successful option for me. Maybe I just use one nuclear weapon, and even it's a tactical nuclear weapon, that might be enough to stop you in your tracks. Maybe it won't, but if I think you're coming for me anyway, well, what do I have to lose? You're in that very, very sort of dire situation. And the really important point is you don't have to actually be in that dire situation, objectively speaking. All I have to do is perceive that I might be, and that's enough to spur me into action. This is what we really worry about. And so I think you're right. It really complicates the deterrence calculus. I mean, deterrence is always difficult. This is one of the things that I think lots and lots of people misunderstand about deterrence, because we've had these concepts of nuclear deterrence now for decades. We haven't had a nuclear war. We sort of think, look, it works. It's relatively easy. You know, I threaten you enough, you threaten me enough. We're both mutually deterred. Away we go. But getting that balance right between deterrence, so making threats on the one hand, and assurance on the other, assuring you that I'm only trying to deter your attack against me. I don't have aggressive intentions. I'm not coming for you. I'm not planning a preemptive counterforce strike. Getting that balance is extremely difficult. It's what often in the academic literature, we refer to that as the Goldilocks dilemma, using the children's tale of Goldilocks, who is trying these different bowls of porridge, I think it is from memory, and getting the one that's not too hot, not too cold, not too salty, not too sweet. It's just right. Absolutely. This is the deterrence problem. You need to threaten just enough, but not so much that you actually end up inducing the behavior that you were trying to avoid in the first place.
Absolutely.
So deterrence is already difficult. If we're now throwing in new capabilities into the mix, which makes it very hard, or makes it harder, I should say, to calculate when an attack that's happening in the context of a hot war is an attack on your nuclear forces or not. That's a much, much harder problem. And then, I'm sorry to say, if this wasn't, difficult enough, I think there's an added layer of complexity that relates to these strategic non-nuclear capabilities. And this is something that I've just published an article on very recently, is that it's not just the nuclear armed states that are arming themselves with some of these capabilities. Now, for the first time, and this is something genuinely new, some non-nuclear armed allies are now arming themselves with these capabilities as well. So there's an extra set of actors to deal with.
Absolutely. And which is where, if I might point to another issue. So the non-nuclear weapon state has developed capabilities which, the only difference being that the warheads are not nuclear, and they target, let's say, the adversary's SSBN, let's say in the Black Sea, right?
Yep.
And so how does one respond to that? So it's also an issue of which state is attacking, in this case, a state that is already aggrieved and thinks that, Russia has done it grievous wrong, and it has the capability, which is conventional, but it can take out a Russian SSBN. So how does, that situation unfold from there? And frankly, deterrence holds until it doesn't, kind of a thing, where, Lawrence Friedman said, when he was talking about the Schelling school of thought and the Kant school of thought, and he said at the end of the day, it was sheer luck that saved us from not getting destroyed. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example of that.
Absolutely.
I mean, what was happening above the surface between Khrushchev's hard letter and soft letter and how to deal with that, below the surface, that if the captain of that Russian sub had actually fired those nuclear missiles, if the XO Arkhipov had not prevailed upon him and stopped him, you and I might not be doing this program.
Probably wouldn't be here having this discussion.
On this day in 2024.
That's the reality of it. Yeah. And if Arkhipov
so
hadn't happened to be on that particular submarine, there was, I think, from memory, 4 that were traveling in convoy, and he happened to be on that particular one and was able to sort of countermand the decision, as it were. Yeah. There's an enormous amount of luck that's baked into that.
Absolutely, because, and you know, I'm fond of giving this example, because even if, as happened above the surface, with which letter to respond to, with Tommy Thompson saying you go for the soft letter, let
Khrushchev's first letter or his second letter,
right? But all of that would have come to naught if that submarine had actually fired the nuclear,
exactly. And so if we think of
one of the things that I, my takeaway from some of your writings is that the situation is becoming extremely complicated. And even if we were to consider, and this is where I want to get your take, and I, because my own is pretty bleak. So let's assume that there is no increasing distrust among states. Let's assume there are no major wars right now. And let's assume that relative global peace to be a constant. Nonetheless, there are a number of emerging technologies, cyberspace, blockchains, and lethal autonomous weapons, the application of artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. In tandem and alone, a lot is unknown, because we also don't have the control regimes for many of these, because they haven't really emerged.
That's right.
As such. We already know how difficult technological regimes can be if we look at the complexity of the Wassenaar regime, for instance. How is this going to play out in a world where, as I said in my opening, trust is not just in short supply, it's running deep deficits?
So I think if we think of this in, as you say, that hypothetical scenario where, Russia hasn't reinvaded Ukraine, the US and China have come to some sort of agreement over Taiwan, and tensions are very low, and sort of great power jostling isn't going on, and so forth. Even then, what I think we would still see, and I think what we have seen recently, and it's been sort of turbocharged, if you like, by those great power tensions and the lack of trust, is an effect on arms racing. Because the reality is today, none of these strategic non-nuclear weapons on their own are able to completely compromise anyone's nuclear forces, even a small nuclear capability, even, say, North Korea's, right? However, the prospect of those capabilities being used in combination, so it's not just precision strike capabilities, it's not just missile defense systems, it's not just anti-satellite capabilities, anti-submarine warfare capabilities, whatever it is, it's all of them used in combination and sort of adding to each other, as it were, in the future, that drives decision-making today. Because a nuclear force planner can't just sit back and say, look, I've had a look at the data, and missile defense testing rates of my adversary aren't that good. I don't think the system works terribly well. I just don't need to worry about it. I will still be able to get a few missiles through at the very least, and that will be enough to deter them. And yes, they talk a big game on their new anti-submarine warfare capabilities and underwater drones and all the rest, but I don't buy it. I don't think they're going to be able to find my nuclear-armed submarine, so it's fine. Well, that would be a pretty risk-tolerant nuclear planner, because what if you got that wrong? Right? Are you going to be the one with your neck on the chopping block saying, sorry, Madam President, sorry, Mr. Prime Minister, I didn't think they were good enough to get our forces, but it turns out they were, right? So you tend to have, as a nuclear force planner, you have very, very low risk tolerance. There's lots of great quotes from former defence secretaries and defence ministers saying, we, including people like Robert McNamara, saying we spent years building our forces around assumptions about what the other side seemed likely to develop or possibly could develop in the future.
No, but you absolutely, sorry, I'm just interjecting, but just to reinforce the point that you're making in terms of calculation and decision making, this is something that happened with Curtis LeMay, talking about taking out the Soviet arsenal, and with Kennedy asking how many of those can be taken out.
Exactly.
And so even if you were to take out 499 out of 500, the 500th one, which of the cities would you want?
Would you
can afford destroy? Is it going to be New York, Chicago, LA? What?
Exactly. But if you had a missile defense system that you were pretty confident against that one missile, maybe it couldn't defend against 100, but we're pretty confident it can get the one. It might make you think slightly differently about that calculation, right? And so that's where we're seeing this already. We're seeing, as you said at the outset, nuclear armed states, this sort of secular trend downwards in nuclear arsenals has plateaued and to some extent is actually dipping back up. You even see states like the UK is now talking about increasing the size of its stockpile. Obviously, the Pakistani capability, the Indian capability, the Chinese capability, these are growing. They're not getting smaller, they're going up. And of course, Russian and American forces have completely stalled. They were heading down, and then they seem to have hit this sort of end point in terms of reductions. And not only that, we're seeing states making very clear decisions that are obviously motivated by ensuring that they have a second strike, a survivable second strike capability. China is the one that everyone's talking about because they're building these new missile silos and so forth.
That's the fastest growing.
And it's very obvious as to why. I mean, if you were worried about an adversary like the US developing these strategic non-nuclear capabilities, giving it a greater counterforce strike potential, well, one of the things you do is you make yourself a harder target to hit. You just build more land-based silos. So if they do have to think about it, they've really got to think, could we definitely get all of them? As you said, if you can only get 499 out of the 500, well, that means I need to have 500, not 200, but 500. Building quieter submarines so that they're harder to track and compromise. So in peacetime, we see this effect, peacetime in inverted commas, we see this effect on arms racing. Yeah. And then, as you say, in closer to the reality we're in much more tense times in which flashpoints and crises are a real prospect, and the idea of a conventional conflict between major nuclear armed powers is not so distant anymore. Well, then we have the problem of how do you engage in effective, successful crisis signaling in a world that has these conventional weapons, these strategic non-nuclear capabilities? How do you sort of have a future Cuban Missile Crisis again, which includes strategic non-nuclear capabilities in the mix and includes allies, so non-nuclear armed states, the likes of, let's say, if you're imagining a crisis over Taiwan, we've got US allies in South Korea, Japan, in my own country, in Australia, who are arming themselves with strategic non-nuclear weapons as well. So it's not just that, to use the Cuban analogy, it's not just the Soviets and the Americans signaling to each other. And as we said, that was difficult enough. Do you believe the intent in Khrushchev's first letter or his second letter? And how do you communicate with the submarine commanders below the surface and all the rest? But you've also got, you've got Beijing and Washington signaling to each other, but you've also got Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, perhaps others sending what might even be inadvertent signals with their conventional capabilities as well. So it's a much more complex. It doesn't mean it's impossible to successfully manage that crisis, but it does make it much, much harder.
Absolutely. Now, I just mentioned this debate that's going on in Seoul with reference to getting nuclear weapons. And at one level, I understand it perfectly. in the sense that if you look at the French decision after the Suez humiliation, they decided that they're going to have their own nuclear deterrent, and a number of cases there. But I want to get your take on another issue, which is that if we, obviously the emerging technologies are there and technological demonstration and the rest of it is very, very important. But at the end of the day, deterrence is a psychological phenomenon. And the idea that in a short conflict, if that dyad is drawing different lessons about the outcome, that creates another problem. Let me give you a very recent example. The Israeli illicit attack on the Iranian consulate, a diplomatic building, which is obviously prohibited under international law. Then Iran's response. Now, I'm going to focus on Iran's response. The Iranians knew, the Americans knew, the Israelis knew, everyone knew the band within which Iran would launch the attack. Yeah. And within that theater, the top of the line, top shelf air defense capabilities and anti-cruise and ballistic missile capabilities were arrayed against the Iranian attack. Now, Israel says 99% of those missiles and drones were taken out. Iran claims victory, saying that 6 to 7 of those ballistic missiles went through the world's best possible shield at that particular point in time, right? And hit a couple of Iranian military targets.
Yeah.
So the lessons being drawn are different. And
That's right.
So
Yeah.
in terms of perceptions, and then those perceptions feeding into decision-making in the future, create another kind of problem. Now, let me further complicate this. What if those 6 or 7 Iranian ballistic missiles that went through this shield had strategic warheads?
And then
So if the Iranians were to calculate this, they'd say, okay, if we attack Israel, we know that US and its allies, including some Arab allies, will provide Israel with a shield. But we therefore have to move towards acquiring a different kind of capability. And we have just seen that we can penetrate that shield, even if it means 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 missiles. Yeah. So my point is that we have the problem of technologies, but then we also have the problem of perceptions.
Absolutely. And there's really no escaping that. We often, I think if we focus, and it's always a risk in this sort of area because we're talking about the impact of particular technologies. And the risk is that we become so focused on the technologies themselves and the military balance and the kind of fine-grained analysis of that. But what we forget is that ultimately it's humans who make decisions about these things. And as you say, humans who draw lessons from some particular incident or crisis or whatever. And if you and I both draw roughly the same lessons, well, that we might be able to come to some sort of arrangement which lowers tensions and decreases risks and so forth. But there's no guarantee of that. And one of the things, I think you're exactly right, I think from that incident, the Iranians learnt quite a bit about how the Israeli missile defense system works. I don't think they were terribly concerned about having lots of missiles shot down, because even having those missiles shot down teaches you things about how it works. there's a reason why I think they conducted the attack in the way in which they did, in which I think was a fair. I don't think they were terribly surprised that lots of them were shot down.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. They get all sorts of information from that, and then they draw their own lessons, and we can try and shape those lessons. I mean, this is the nature of all aspects of coercive diplomacy, of which deterrence is one. You're trying to shape the other side's perceptions and therefore their actions, but ultimately it's them who will decide what lessons they take and how they read this and so forth. And so this is one of the reasons I think in this new sort of messier, more complicated nuclear era where we have this nuclear conventional entanglement, we have more actors involved and so forth, there is a great benefit, I think, to be had from relatively modest activities like dialogues, like just speaking to the other side, keeping channels of communication open. Now, some will say, look, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, a bit, sort of woolly. We're talking about, nuclear crises here and you just want to talk, right? But ultimately, the only thing we have is trying to understand the other side and their perspectives better. We don't have to agree with it. We can vehemently, violently disagree. But as long as we understand where they're coming from, we've got a much better sense or much better chance of getting out of these kind of situations without going to hell in a handbasket.
Ben, I completely agree with you. As a matter of fact, I was very lucky at one level because I was on the pug wash circuit. This is
right.
eons ago. And Bob McNamara obviously was a part of, and he was an anguished man at many levels. And he had moved drastically, I would say, or let me not say drastically, I'd say remarkably moved away from many previous positions. And so Errol Morris's documentary on McNamara, The Fog of War, 11 Lessons of the Life of Robert Strange McNamara, the first lesson is empathize with the enemy. So my point being that when we approach, for instance, I mean, we know that Russia aggressed against Ukraine. I mean, it's clear as daylight.
Very clear. Yep.
Right. But we also have to see, if we want to talk and if we want to understand, we also have to see what are the factors that might have pushed Kremlin into doing what it did.
Absolutely.
Now, so from where I stand, looking at these conflicts, the sense that I get is that we are increasingly becoming incapable of empathizing with the enemy. And that then means that there are no channels left. Like, for instance, if Netanyahu says that, we will consider them as Amalek and we're going to destroy them because that's what the Bible said. That's what God said in the Bible, that you are to destroy them. Every one of them, women, children, men, cattle, everything. And if you apply that to a real life situation and say, okay, we are going to destroy all of them without saying, why did Hamas do what it did? I mean, things don't happen in vacuum. People are not stupid.
Out of the blue. Exactly.
People are not stupid. So what I'm saying is that while completely agreeing with you that that's the only way to move forward, especially in the kind of, mess that we have gotten ourselves in, but that is also becoming extremely difficult precisely because of the mess that we've gotten ourselves in.
Exactly. It's I mean, I would love to disagree with you. I'd say, no, look, you've got it wrong. But depressingly, I think you're exactly right. We seem to be in an era in which it's sort of, it's almost out of fashion to even want to try to put yourself in the shoes of the other and even say, look, I don't have to like them. I can disagree with them. I can find that them, morally, objectionable, all the rest. But I do have to try and understand them. because otherwise I'm going to get nowhere. If I'm not going to even try, well, we are on a path to conflict. It's just a matter of when, not if, right? I guess if I'm trying to put my optimistic hat on, the good news, I think, is that this is not a new problem per se.
Yeah.
If you think of the early years of the US-Soviet Cold War, we were in a roughly similar situation where both sides of that divide, as it were, sort of became very insular, sort of turned in and became full of certitude. We're quite certain that their model for how the world should work was the correct one, and the other side were just plain wrong, and that anything and everything they did was motivated by aggressive intentions, and all we can do is push back, and if you do anything but push them back, you're just giving way. And that did lead to some extremely dangerous situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis, multiple Berlin crises, Korean War, so forth. But we did learn from those crises and got better at empathizing. So in a sense, my glimmer of hope is to say it is possible. We've shown that it's possible to have in a sense, I think of it almost as a more kind of enlightened or actually just more mature position that says, look, ultimately, whether they're right or wrong doesn't matter. They're doing what they're doing because they think they're right. We've got to find some way of engaging with them as they are in the here and now, not as we'd like them to be in a perfect world. It's a sort of a small R realism in a way, right? Saying, look, I wish we didn't have the Russia that we had. I wish we didn't have whoever, state X that we have, but we do. And you have to deal with them as they are. And I think getting back to a position politically where it's okay to accept something less than total victory is going to be really important. And it has all sorts of really concrete effects in policy terms. I mean, even some of the conventional weapons technologies we've been talking about, you only deploy them if you just don't take the other side's concerns seriously. I think missile defense is the greatest example of this. When the US withdrew from the ABM treaty, which was the treaty that effectively banned missile defense between the US and the Soviet Union, signed in 1972, it actually more accurately dramatically limited it, but in effective terms, it banned it. When the US pulled out of that at the end of 2001 and that came into effect the following year, the Russians and the Chinese were not quiet about it. They went backwards in coming forwards and saying, look, this is a bad idea. This is very destabilizing. If you've got the ability to defend against incoming attacks, you've got the ability to defend against our retaliation. What's going to deter you from attacking us? And all the US ever came up with as a response was, trust us, it'll be fine. We won't aim this at you. We'll keep it limited. We'll keep it small. This is about rogue states. This is, your Irans and North Koreas and so forth. And the Russians and the Chinese consistently said, look, what are we meant to do? Just take you on good faith? Really? You've got to see it from our point of view. And the Americans just refused to do so. So that unwillingness to put yourself in the shoes of the other and think, I see how this could cause some problems for them. Maybe we need to come at this from a different angle. And I hold out hope that at some point we're going to get back to having at least some understanding of this basic need, driven simply by the desire for self-preservation. That if we don't have
absolutely. This, although frankly, Ben, the fact is that if I look at what's happening on the climate front, it seems to me that our we kind of we're not particularly good. It might be a collective action problem. We're not particularly good at trying to sort of prevent something which is staring us in the face. But going back to what you said, and I'm happy that you mentioned this. Reagan himself said, "Trust but verify." So the point is that when the Cold War started with these arsenals, deterrence was at its basic and pure level. In the sense that, listen, I am not going to bother you because I know that you can punish me and I can't take that punishment. But by the same logic, you should leave me alone because I also have the capability to punish you, and that punishment you cannot take.
Exactly.
And so that is the very basic sort of primer kind of pure deterrence. But then we began to complicate it. We began to complicate it with MRVs, with MIRVs, with increasing the accuracy of the missiles, moving from counter value to counter force targeting, talking about flexible response, talking about salami slicing, then going into the ballistic missile defenses and so on and so forth. So we have, through our technology demonstrators, already complicated the deterrence calculus. So
it's strange, isn't it? It's sort of, on the one hand, we say we believe in deterrence, we have a deterrence posture, but on the other hand, we keep developing technologies that actually undermine our ability to deter.
Absolutely. If we had stayed at that basic primer level, or what I call the purity of deterrence, if we had stayed at that level, we might actually have been able to get back to complete disarmament at some point.
Yeah, it's the kind of logical endpoint.
We haven't, because we are never satiated. But it always reminds me of Ralph Lapp's The Tyranny of Weapons Technology. I mean, we just keep doing things because we can do these things. We have the intelligence to do that, and we have this desire to innovate. And we also get ourselves into a lot of mess by doing it. But Ben, there's a lot more to discuss, but thank you so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it. Gentlemen, that's it from this episode. If you like the discussion, give the program a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It doesn't give me any lucre, frankly, but would certainly make me very happy. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.